David used to come to the studio on 39th Street, I don't know how many times. I must have drawn him 50, 60 times. I painted him about 12 times. When I finished a number of paintings, and he came over, and he looked at it, and he said, I like that one. I like that one. That one looks like everybody. That's David. And there's not too much else to say about him except that incredible intelligence sometimes worked. It didn't always work. And we have to respect that. And I miss him. I miss him terrible. And I almost have nothing else to say, except maybe I should read this. Because one of the few things we used to talk about was our days on the road. We never were together, but different. And this is partly one of his stories. Thank you. Later. I once passed through St. Louis in 1954 at age 18 en route to a summer job in an iron mill in Pueblo, Colorado. The train stopped for an hour. It was 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. Everyone derailed and drifted about under the Art Nouveau ironwork of the depot, which had been specially built for the Exposition of 1904, turn of the century, St. Louis having been a great city, or at least a big dusty town on a prairie. Mark Twain was still alive. I had known someone who knew Mark Twain, Mrs. Adams Mayer, better known by her pen name of Dorothy Quick, was the author of a weekly column in my parents' newspaper, the East Hampton Star. She had published several books of verse and was undoubtedly one of the worst poets in the history of American letters. She had a framed snapshot of Mark Twain holding her, a toddler, in his arms on a deck chair aboard a transatlantic steamer around 1900. Since that unforgettable day, Dorothy had lived a long and happy life in a penthouse at 1050 Fifth Avenue with her companion, Miss Voorhees, housekeeper Edith, and a chauffeur Lincoln, who drove her around town in the 1932 Rolls with silver elephant to her totem animal on the hood, and a round porthole for a rear window, as well as 2 miniature poodles, Victory and Quickie. They were both males and frequently engaged in bestial acts until Dorothy cried, "Oh, do stop, Victory, down, Quickie," as they ran around Edith and the maid to separate the animals and carry them off, squirming and snapping to the kitchen. Outside the station or depot was a long line of moviegoers waiting to get under a marquee proclaiming "Intruder in the Dust." The roof of the theater in the depot glowed like orange sherbet in the setting sun. To this day, I have no idea whether the St. Louis station was properly or originally termed a depot. At the age I referred to all of us railroads, U.S. railroad stations, except for Union, South, Grand Central, and Pennsylvania stations as depots. This was what my Uncle Daniel Hunting had taught me to call them. A lifelong horseman and painter of horses, my Uncle Dan had attempted to join the Rough Riders while hanging around their encampment in Montauk, where they were quarantined because of the yellow fever epidemic on their return from Cuba in 1898, where Dan was 16. Hunting Sr. had thwarted the desire of enlistment in some fashion that humiliated the son, and as a result, Dan had remained for the rest of his life stuck in time warp that included books by Theodore Roosevelt and Frederick Remington, Frank Leslie's illustrated newspapers, and a complete run of Harper's Monthly Magazine from circa 1850 to 1910. Both unmarried, Dan and his sister Minnie shared the family house across from the Presbyterian Church on Main Street, East Hampton, over a period extending from the presidency of McKinley to that of JFK. Uncle Dan disliked automobiles and seldom rode in one. He referred to the train as the cars, an expression that has seen its day already when he was a boy in the 1890s. He could remember the New York cars and their South Fork terminus in Sag Harbor, and you had to use Jerry Baker's stage to come along to East Hampton, where all the roads were dirt. Influenced by Uncle Dan, I've secretly planned a solo railway journey up and down New England in the summer of 1948 when I was 12. My itinerary, I thought, from advertisements found in Harper's Magazine dating from the 1870s that covers both the name and the various ancestors, scribbled in pencil, Judge Hedges, his Miss Hunting, the long in S in Miss was an eye-opener. I started writing letters to the railroad ticket office listed in the advertisements, requesting new schedules, but using the addresses that appeared in the old magazines. Though already proficient typist, I wrote the letters out in longhand, in ink, using steel pens with detachable nibs and sealing the letters with a red and green sealing wax purchased from the East Hampton News Company at the corner of Main and Newton Lane, where old Ben Barnes, the proprietor, lobster red, shaky and hungover, watched me dawdle through antique paper kites and glides and pre-World War writing supplies with mingled amusement and exploration. I knew those railroad lines listed in the 1870s Harvard had the most part vanished from the earth. Yet the action of writing up to them, using old-fashioned materials and implements, archaic language, and phantom addresses was an experiment in ceremonial magic, an attempt to raise the dead and converse with them in the powers of the pen. The letters all came back, except for one addressed to the Boston and Maine Railroad, which had been forwarded to the company's office in Hartford. The agent who opened my letter of inquiry, no doubt, guessed the age and disposition of the inquirer. He sent me an elaborate, courteous, handwritten reply, enclosing the new schedules and wishing me luck on my travels. Turning my back on the movie house, I strode into a package store, taking a chance they wouldn't check my ID. I got 2 fists of Kinsey Silver Seal and a couple of 6-packs of Ballantine Ale. By the time the train pulled out, I was swinging the Kinsey and had chosen the brand banks to the recently published I had chosen that brand because to the recently published Kinsey report. The previous summer in Paris, I had frequent intercourse with a certain street boy who did it for love a couple of times when I was broke, even led to believe that I was giving her pleasure. I had been unwillingly celibate ever since in the conditioned nightmare of America, poring over my traveler's companion editions of Henry Miller in room 408, Street Hall, Dartmouth. I unbuttoned my shirt, put the whiskey in my suitcase, opened a bottle of ale, and getting out my green pocket testament, turned to the last book. While following the extravagant magic lantern show of John's imagination, I tried to visualize the cave of the Apocalypses on Patmos, where he originally received his revelations. I did my best to picture John himself, but his features remained veiled in the mind's eye. Now this is a tongue twister. To reveal, it occurred to me, means both to reveal, veil, or put on another veil, and to veil or take it off. Revelation comes in a flash, a bright mist, a mystery. You see it clear then, close to your eyes. Each disclosure reveals what it reveals at the instant it deveils it. Having revealed it, it veils again in blinding darkness. Hours later, my head bangs against the seat in front of me. There had been an accident. Passengers were picking themselves off the floor. We stood in the middle of the wheat-filled midday heat, shimmering in the brightness between the air-conditioned cars and the horizon. My arms were covered with goose flesh. My liquor was intact in the bag between my feet. People walked forward to see what had happened. I followed. Someone said, "What a shame for a Sunday morning." Reaching the open door, I swung down onto the tar road and crossed the tracks into the middle of where some patches of fresh blood next to the train. Nearby, a white hat with fake roses sat in the dust. A conductor said, "The worst is up front." A flashing red light bounced over the wheat fields. The woman lived by herself in a farmhouse a mile up the road. Always walked to the church this way. Must have been lighthearted from the heat. A dream came back, one that had been recurring ever since childhood. It was a proper nightmare, but a sinister daydream or reverie, edged with something like what Klebnikov called the giggling of mirrors. The sun could shine, and the wee folk inhabiting storybooks be ever so snug in their wee houses. But somewhere, just out of sight, there was a shrilling as though of a lasting falsetto voice. It seemed as if everything around me was a mockery of what it ought to be. Caught up in the horrible, tingling wave of brightness and derision, I imagined an irresistible force pulling me towards a huge machine inside of which I was going to be crushed and ripped to pieces. As this train sped across a dry, empty plain, several hours later, ever with the wind in my face, at the open door and the cool sunset, I was too dizzy to stand up very long. A sandwich man sold me a dry ham sandwich. I washed it down with a beer and a couple of swigs of Kinsey, then slept like a log all the way to Denver. That's it.